All right. In this lecture, we are going to start establishing the southern colonies, and we're going to start with Virginia because that one was the first one. And so we're going to start by talking about the London Company. The London Company was a group of wealthy investors in London, England at the time. And what they basically did is they just pooled their money together and created something called a joint stock company. And the idea of this was that they weren't going to go themselves to the New World. They would outfit ships. They would pay for the supplies that the people needed to get started, and then they really hoped for a return on their investment. And at least initially, they thought that would be in gold. They thought that they could get gold in the New World, and that it would be a quick return, and they would get their money back and make a bunch of money. Now, this turned out to be very, very wrong, but at least that was the hope of the joint stock company. All right, so they established Jamestown in 1607, and with about 100 people. They started off with nearly 150 people, and by the time they actually picked a site and started establishing Jamestown, they were down to about 100 people. It was a very, very dangerous trip over. People were dying of dysentery. When they got to Jamestown, they started dying of malaria, and soon they would be dying of starvation. Now, they started going up the Chesapeake Bay, thinking that there would be a passage to get to Asia, and they were very wrong, obviously. And they ended up picking a site on what they called the James River on a little island, simply because it was defensible. They knew there were natives around, and so they picked a place that they could, build a palisade, kind of a fort around. And the site was about as awful as you could pick. They really couldn't grow anything on the land. Salt water would get up that far in the river, so they really had poor drinking water. It was infested with mosquitoes, and so people would get malaria. It was really about as bad of a place as they could pick. Many of the people that came were gentlemen. They were second and third sons of from wealthy families. They were gentlemen, and they brought servants with them, and they were really only interested in finding gold. They certainly weren't interested in working. They didn't build proper accommodations. They didn't know how to grow food. In short, these people were not survivalists, and they really struggled to the point where the colony was almost on the verge of collapse until really an adventurer, a military man, kind of almost like a mercenary by the name of John Smith, who was in their group, basically had enough and instituted kind of a draconian those who shall not work shall not eat kind of rule, and helped Jamestown get through the first year of its existence. And if it wasn't for Captain Smith, they probably, many of them would have probably died, and the colony would have failed. His relations with the Native Americans were good sometimes and not so good. Other times, there's a story that Disney portrays that John Smith was saved by Pocahontas and that they ended up marrying, and that is not true. Pocahontas ends up marrying John Rolfe, which we'll talk about later. But Smith was instrumental in at least having good enough relations with the natives that they got along. They got some of the things that they needed from them, and then they started doing their best to grow food before supplies could come in. And really, Smith is responsible for, at least at the first part, saving the colony. Okay, but Jamestown would continue to struggle. And even after about 500 more people were sent to the colony in 1609, they had a terrible winter. Captain John Smith and Pocahontas, or Captain John Smith got hurt in some sort of skirmish with Native Americans. He got hurt. He ended up having to go back to England, and so Jamestown was leaderless during the winter of 1609-1610. And the colony was just in dire times. They resorted a lot of people to eating rats and shoe leather. And there was a story about a man digging up his wife corpse and eating her. There's all sorts of bad things that went on during the winter of 1609, 1610. And you went from having a population of about 500 to the next spring only having about 60 people alive. And so that time is called the starving time. When the spring came, the survivors got on on a ship, and they started heading down the James River down to the Chesapeake, and they just happened to be intercepted by a guy by the name of Governor Lord De La Warr. And De La Warr, he intercepted the ship, and he said, "Hey, we've got reinforcements. I'm telling you, you need to turn around." And he kind of did the same thing that John Smith did. He instituted kind of a harsh rule and started organizing people into work gangs. And with his help, Jamestown was going to, they not necessarily thrive, but they were going to stay established. Okay, the next person that I think that probably needs mentioning is John Rolfe. And so John Rolfe is actually the guy that ends up marrying Pocahontas. But what John Rolfe's real contribution is to Jamestown is that he really is the guy that starts kind of experimenting with different strains of tobacco, and he ends up bringing one down from the Caribbean and kind of mixing it with the strain that was available in Virginia. And tobacco would become the first cash crop that would be of any significance to Jamestown and then eventually to Virginia. And it's going to have all kinds of consequences and impacts on the environment, the people, the importation of at first indentured servants and then slaves. But more importantly, for the time being, is that John Rolfe was able to create an economic foundation for Jamestown to survive. Now, eventually, John Rolfe is going to marry Pocahontas, and they end up actually moving to England, and Pocahontas ends up dying. And then again, without John Rolfe, the colony struggles. And there's tobacco. Okay. With tobacco, Virginia started to expand because, when you plant tobacco, it's very hard on the soil, and so you need more land. At the same time, the Virginia Company, they wanted more people to settle, and the only way they could do this was by offering land. And so that brings us to what's called the headright system. And so the headright system was 50 acres of land for each person that bought a headright. And then if you paid for other people, then you would get an additional 50 acres. So if you were buying for a family of 4, then you would get 200 acres of land. And as you could probably see, this is where we start to get things that resemble plantations, because you're going to have a lot of land for a very few amount of people that own these things. Now, still, though, a lot of families did not come over, and this is one of the key things that we need to remember in terms of differences between the northern colonies and the southern colonies. The southern colonies, it's mostly males coming over. There were not a lot of females that came over, and we'll talk about kind of the consequences of those later. To bring more workers over, a lot of people that own these headrights, they would hire what were called indentured servants, and these were people that couldn't afford a headright. And so the people would pay for their headright. They would come over, and they would work for a period of time, and usually that was about 4 to 7 years. They weren't slaves, but they were tied to the land. Think of them more of like serfs, but serfs with a future. Once they worked out their indentured contract, then they were given their own land. A lot of times the headright owner would give them tools, and then the person would go be a landowner themselves. But that was one of the ways that they started to populate Virginia and be able to work the land to grow tobacco. The problem, though, that this causes is that as more headrights are bought and as more people come in, you're infringing upon Native American land. And the Native American group that was outside of Jamestown, It was a confederacy group called the Powhatan Indians, and the relationship between the English and the Powhatans was really spotty at best. Um, and it culminated in both 1622 and 1644 with the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. Now, after that, what we need to understand is that even though the settlers at Jamestown, many of them were killed in both of these wars, really it's the Powhatans that lose, and they were weakened to the point where it allowed further expansion of the land at the expense of the Powhatan Indians. Okay, also notable around this time in 1619, it's kind of an ironic year because of two very opposite firsts in America and in Virginia in particular. The first one is the establishment of the House of Burgesses. This was a colonial self-governing body that resembled Parliament in a way. It was kind of a small version of Parliament. And people that were landowners, male landowners, they were able to join the House of Burgesses, and they elected their officials. And this was really the first time in what we would later call the United States that we have an elected body or a self-governing body. Now, that same year that we have this creation of democracy, we also have another first, and this is not a good first, and that was in 1619, a Dutch ship dropped off a shipment of African slaves. And as indentured servants would work the headright system, slaves weren't needed as much. But once that pool of indentured servants dries up in England, then plantation owners were going to start importing African slaves. And 1619 was the first year that they did that. Okay, and so to kind of sum up things, here's the Chesapeake region. You can see where Jamestown was. And this marks the end of establishing the Southern Colonies of Virginia.